it gathers together everything around the processes of heart disease, and it shows what it's not because it cannot be, and then it shows what it is because the evidence clearly demonstrates that. But it will be a surprise to a lot of people, particularly cholesterol lowering people, what the actual truth is. But I love the way then at the end it gets into the actions you take. So it's not just about the processes and what it is and what it isn't, which would give people a good guide as to what they need to do to avoid it. But you actually summarize all of the key things, the best evidence-based things to counter these processes.
And I think the other thing that I thought was important was because it's an issue that you never really see covered, is like, well, if you do this, so if you lower the blood pressure and it's high, well, how much extra life expectancy could you get from this? Are we talking 10 years, a month, a week, 5 seconds? It's something that's really just not done by the mainstream, I think, is this issue of increase in life expectancy. It's funny because in cancer treatment, that's the only thing that really matters, and it's the figure you get. If you take this drug for 2 years, you are likely to live on average 6 months longer, or whatever it is. That's the increase in median survival. So essentially I thought, well, of course that's what most matters to people. There's no point in doing something if it's going to say also if it's going to reduce your risk of dying of heart disease but increases your risk of dying of other things, because in the end that's what we call a complete waste of time. And there's quite a lot of actions and activities that are like this. So when I looked at things like, if you look at statins, for instance, there is a reduction in cardiovascular disease in some people. And you say, well, what does that extrapolate to in life expectancy saving? Even if you, well, and we share the same ideas that pharmaceutical company sponsored trials may overemphasize benefit hugely. Even if you accept them an absolute face value, there was a study done in the British Medical Journal Open. I'd actually done it, my own study, which managed not to get published. So what is the increase in life expectancy from the most beneficial studies that you can find about statins? And it came to 0.75 of a day of increased life expectancy per year of taking the statin. And that was only for the group of people who already had existing heart disease. So the actual benefit comes down to if, and that's based on 5 years of clinical trials, because that's as long as those trials are. If you say, well, let's assume it continued for 40 years, that benefit continued for 40 years, which we have no evidence that it does, but let's assume it does. What we're talking about is in the order of about half of a month or maybe a month maximum of increased life expectancy for taking a statin for 40 years. And that's only in one very small group of people. So when you present it in that way, I think you're also presenting it in a way that people go, well, is that it? And you go, well, yes, that is it. And yet, if they had even the slightest side effect or adverse effect, even if it was 1/400% of damage, it wouldn't be worth it from the perspective of your overall quality of life for the next 40 years. Because then people can say, well, how much longer can I get? If I do this thing that's going to make my quality of life rubbish for the next 40 years, is it really worth it? Well, until you know how much you're going to get, then there's no point in having that discussion. And this is something that GPs, doctors, cardiologists, almost no one will tell you. So how much longer am I likely to get? You never get this information. It's quite difficult to establish it exactly. It's quite a complicated thing to do, and you are pushing the boundaries of assumptions quite widely at times. But you can tell. I mean, you can do this, and so that's really one of the I thought the most important thing. Can you get an extra 10 years? Can you get an extra 20 years? Can you get an extra 5 years? Is that worth it to you? Then you can make the decision. So I think that I considered that to be sort of a key way of looking at it.
Yeah, and the funny thing, Malcolm, is it's the absolute centerpiece of industry, engineering, of anything that spends money, right, to get a return, is the cost-benefit analysis. It's central to everything. Everything we did for 25 years always had a cost-benefit, even small projects. And yet it's missing here, completely missing. And we see it as well with any mass medications, really. I even did back of an envelope once. I had a discussion with a cardiologist, and it happened upon cervical cancer. And you know, the vaccine for cervical cancer, which affects the HPV organism, which often promotes cervical cancer. But when you actually look at the numbers, the number needed to treat in that case is astonishingly enormous for an extremely rare, a very sad disease, but extremely rare in terms of mortality rate. And so wherever you look and apply cost benefit, not everywhere, but on most of the mass medications, you just go, oh my God, it's frightening, the lack of benefit per cost. So there you go. But you know what we might start with is the what it's not. So heart disease is a process, atherosclerosis. It's a multi-factor process, in fairness, and that's not a cop-out. Some people say, oh, it's a multifactorial, there's 200 causes, there's nothing we can do about addressing it. But no, honestly, it's multifactorial, but you've got down to the kernel. But one of the things that most people believe it at least has a lot to do with is cholesterol. So is that the primary thing that it's not?
But if the story fits, and this story fits so well into people's ideas, I mean, when you look at the thickenings in people's arteries, the atherosclerosis, they look a bit squidgy and fatty. They've got cholesterol in them. They've got all sorts of other things, and the cholesterol happens to be sort of an incidental finding. When we see fatty, squidgy foods, we look at it and go, ooh, and people are put off by that. You see people who are overweight, and we think, well, I can understand that people are overweight, have got problems. So it kind of fits into a bias that we all have against fatty, greasy, sticky, gooey things. And then someone says we've got fatty, greasy, gooey things in our arteries, and therefore that must be caused by eating. From a very basic, simplistic, easy to understand narrative, this one has really conquered the world. And I hate to say it, but that's about as scientific as it gets. That is the entirety of the science of the cholesterol hypothesis. Gooey, sticky things that you eat become gooey, sticky things in your arteries. And that's that. And therefore, we need to reduce the amount of gooey, sticky things either in the diet or in your bloodstream, and all will be well. Thank you very much. It's like, okay, let's science 101. Every single part of that is so stupid that you almost think like saying, look, I'm not even going to discuss this. It's just ridiculous.
And that is the reality, and yet it would be astonishingly hard for someone to believe that that could be the case, that it's all junk science. And all of the cholesterol lipidologists and specialists, one thing I love that came out in your book, they all focus on the detailed science of the cholesterol particles, but they never stand back and look at the process and what's actually going on. They avoid that like the plague. They draw us down from Thomas Dayspring to Attia to all of them. They draw us down into a complex world of particles and dazzle. It's like the classic shell trick or the magician's trick. You draw the audience down away from logic and simple reality, and you get them where you want them, where you have power over them, majesty. That's what they do in lipidology. The most powerful thing to decide a hypothesis is correct or not is to find a falsifying fact. Way more powerful than finding a supporting fact. You can have 50 supporting facts, you still don't prove it. One falsifying fact, and you've disproven it. Now you're doing science.
It is interesting that a whole series of drugs were developed around about the turn of the millennium. $5 billion was, I believe, was spent on researching these drugs. And what they did was they increased the HDL, the high density lipoprotein, the form of lipoprotein that we call good cholesterol. And it reduced the LDL, the low density lipoprotein, the form of lipoprotein we call bad cholesterol. Neither of them are cholesterol. This is another problem, is that the nomenclature is insane. We have substances floating around in our blood that are little spheres which contain fats and cholesterol and other things. And we call them cholesterol. That's like calling a car a human being, because cars have human beings inside them. We also call some of these lipoproteins, we call them triglycerides, because they contain triglycerides, going back to my tetrapids the citrapins lowered the low-density lipoprotein by up to 40%. In one case, 37% reduction, more than most statins. Increased the high-density lipoprotein by about 120%, virtually doubled it. Now, according to all the hypotheses kicking around, that we should have seen a dramatic reduction in the rate of cardiovascular disease. The actual rate of reduction of cardiovascular disease we saw from these drugs combined was a slight increase in cardiovascular disease. Now, these drugs didn't launch for the very simple reason that they achieved absolutely nothing. And even some of the cardiologists who are sort of internationally famous, Stephen Nissen, probably the most influential cardiologist in the world, looked at these results and said, oh, well, maybe we've got everything wrong. I mean, he's changed his mind since, obviously. But he said, well, actually, it looks like raising HDL isn't a good idea, and it looks like maybe lowering LDL isn't a good idea. And then that was that. You hear nothing more of it. They found a population in Italy who had a very low HDL level. I can't remember exactly, it was like 50% lower than normal. So in theory, this wonderful protecting good cholesterol should have done good. But they had a very, very low rate of heart disease, much lower than the surrounding population. And the heart disease in Italy is relatively low compared to, well, quite low compared to the UK or US or Ireland or whatever. They said, well, that doesn't make any sense. So what's going on? Well, they looked at their HDL and they said, there's a specific protein attached to it, which we called ApoA1 melano. So they synthesized this protein. They stuck it onto HDL and they injected it into people. And Stephen Nissen said it was amazing. It was like liquid Drano. We could see the cholesterol being pulled out of the plaques. The plaques were disappearing. It was like watching a cloud on a summer's day. It just disappeared. Then the company was sold for $1 billion to Pfizer, who then actually carried out some clinical trials and found it didn't do any bloody good at all. So again, you have this. People find things, they trumpet the wonderfulness of it, and then it disappears, and you think, well, okay, so is anyone willing to change their minds? You know, you look at the factors that women generally have about age-matched about a third or a quarter of the rate of heart disease of men. They generally have higher cholesterol LDL levels than men. So the explanation is, well, they're protected by something. Well, yeah, well, or maybe it doesn't cause heart disease in the first place. So they're not protected. You don't need to look for an explanation because the thing you think is causing heart disease isn't. Anyway, at one point it was confirmed that basically women were protected by their different sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and then they did studies on it and they found that actually no, there is no protection from these substances. In fact, if you give estrogen, progesterone to men for things like prostate cancer, it increases their risk of heart disease. And you may know that we got together with a group of other people and we looked at the LDL level and we looked at this in the population over the age of 60, which is where almost all heart disease deaths occur. We found all the studies we could, we brought them together in a meta-analysis. And what we found was that a higher LDL level was not associated strongly, if at all, and in fact the association was negative, really, overall. In other words, the higher your LDL levels were, the longer you lived. And there was a study in Norway on 50,000 people over 10 years. It's actually the authors wrote to me. I didn't even know the study existed. It was called Hunt 2, carried out in Dellenberg or wherever it was. And they wrote to me and said, oh, look at this. We find that if the cholesterol goes from 5 to about 7, which is 5, 6, 7, above 7, was the figures they looked at. But in women, the highest rate of heart disease occurred in women whose cholesterol was 5 or lower. And the lowest occurred when it was 6.5, 7 and above. And we're talking about quite significant differences here. So you go, well, there you are, you know. And the biggest study, actually, I think it's the biggest study, was done in Austria. It's called the Vorarlberg study. Look at why Eve is an Adam. And they looked at people ages from 10 to 95 over 15 years. This was an enormous study. And what they found was that the lower the cholesterol level was, the higher the mortality rate was in all the population and age groups that they studied. The effect wasn't massive. It was fairly small. But it was still a complete contradiction. And you can find contradictions like this and contradictions like this. In fact, the World Health Organization, this was something that Zoe Harcombe did. She looked at all of the cholesterol levels in all the countries that she could find and found quite a strong negative association between cholesterol and deaths from cardiovascular diseases across 180 countries or whatever it was. The graph was fairly like that, highest heart disease, lowest cholesterol, lowest heart disease, highest cholesterol, across however many countries you want to look at. So the whole thing is we're told the Framingham study was done many years ago. It's a small town near Boston in the US, where they basically, it's a bit like the Truman Show. They got everybody measured everything and said what is associated with heart disease, and it came out with figures which were actually the exact opposite of what the figures said. The figures said that a fall in your LDL level, each 1% fall of your LDL, cholesterol, not LDL, resulted in a 2% reduction in heart disease. But actually, if you look at the figures, and this is the actual figures, the people who had a falling, the highest risk factor for dying of cardiovascular disease was having a falling cholesterol level. Well, the UK Biobank studies, the idea is you gather all the data you can about people and say, what are the things that influence diseases, cancer, heart disease, whatever. And they're doing genetic studies as well, which does run into problems. But in general, the general concept's okay, I think. So they looked at cardiovascular disease and they said, well, what's associated with cardiovascular disease? What can we find? Well, they couldn't find any genetic markers, by the way. That's a hidden away thing. There was nothing specific. All right. What they looked at and they found that, well, diabetes was associated with like a 3.5 increase risk, and smoking was 2.7. Or these figures are off the top of my head. Very high blood pressure, 1.8 times risk. And they looked at per 1 millimole per liter increase in cholesterol levels was associated with an increased risk of 0.98, which to you and me is 1, and 1 is average, all right? In other words, there was no association, and this is looking at, I think it was 500,000 people in one part of the study and 5 million in the other part of the study. No association could be found at all, at all. Yeah. But if you read the paper, the figures are there. There's no comment on this anywhere in the paper. It's quite amusing. It's almost like, better keep quiet about this bit. Because there was another study done in the UK looking at risk factors where they got all the information from 400,000, nearly 500,000 people from GP records. And they said, let's have a look at what's associated with dying of cardiovascular disease. And there were 48 factors identified, some of which were slightly weird things like your liver enzyme levels and whatever. But these are just things that GPs measure. And out of the 48 factors, coming in at number 46 with an increased risk of 0.001 was your LDL level, because they measured LDL. In other words, there was no increased risk at all with an increased level of LDL in this study.
Professor Karl Popper, logic and science man, came out with some genius stuff on the nature of proof, and the asymmetry of proof is what he came out with, and it's stunning and it's so important. I'll just describe it briefly again. There's an asymmetry in proof, and the asymmetry, or the lack of balance, is that you can have many positive bits of evidence supporting a hypothesis and they never prove it, right? You can have massive evidence of white swans being the only swans, but one black swan turns up and the hypothesis is over that there are only white swans, even though you had myriad proofs, because you went to Venezuela and you went to Botswana and you went everywhere and you kept finding, yes, all the swans are white. It never proves it. The asymmetry is that if you find one negative proof against the hypothesis, it's over. There is no debate or discussion. It's over. Now, you might rewrite the hypothesis, change it to accommodate, but it's over. But as you're saying, it's not one or two negative proofs against the cholesterol hypothesis where you could change the hypothesis a little to accommodate them. You know, that could be valid if you're honest. But it's not one or two. It's everywhere you turn. Everywhere you turn. In biophysics, if you look at correlations, if you look at epidemiology and Framingham and all those, you look at the machine learning, advanced studies like you mentioned there with the 500,000 people, and it pulls out what's relevant.
So if you think of LDL as a little taxi particle, you think of an LDL molecule as being about the size of a human being. Endothelial cells, which line all your blood vessels throughout your whole body and act a bit like tiles lining a wall or a tube station or something. Of course, they're much more complicated than that. An endothelial cell is about the size of a Wembley football stadium or a large football stadium, just to give you some idea of the sort of size. Anyway, so the current idea is obviously that if you have more LDL in your bloodstream, it will leak through the endothelium, which is this single layer with a few other bits and pieces, and into the arterial wall behind, where it then gradually builds up and builds up these thickenings. Well, of course, the first thing is why does it only happen in certain places? And why does it not happen in veins or in the blood supply circulation in your lungs? Why only in arteries does this happen? And why only in bits of your arteries? If it's all leaking through everywhere, it should just thicken up as a kind of gradual thickening process. That requires that this little LDL particle comes up to the endothelium and then passes straight through it, and then travels about half a mile, it would be, if you were a human being, to the other side of the cell, where it goes up to this other side of the membrane and then pops out again and then ends up in the artery wall behind. So you can think, well, that is a process that is required to happen, but that process, we know it can't happen because endothelial cell membranes are barriers. They're perfect barriers. Yes, they allow certain things, and we know from recent events that COVID-19 viruses can stick to a receptor on the cell membrane, lock into that, and then be drawn into the cell. We also know that LDL particles or molecules, or whatever you want to call them, as you know, a cell wants LDL inside it. It creates an LDL receptor. The LDL comes along, it locks onto it, and it draws it into the cell. Well, that tells us two things. First of all, LDL can't get into a cell unless there's an LDL receptor there. So the cell must want it in. So this idea that if there's a higher concentration in the bloodstream, well, the cell doesn't care what the concentration is in the bloodstream. It can keep everything out. Cells can prevent the passage of single atoms or ions. There are channels in your cell membrane that allow the passage of ions in and out. And an LDL molecule would be, if an LDL in moving sizes again, if a single atom is the size of a man in a rowing boat, you know, an LDL molecule would be the size of a supertanker. So the cell can keep single atoms out, and yet the idea is if the concentration is higher in the blood, it will just go straight through the cell membrane, rush through the cell, and pop out the other side. Now that requires processes that do not exist in nature. First of all, it would require an inside-out LDL receptor on the other side of the cell membrane. No one's ever suggested such a thing can possibly exist, or what its function would be. That then grabs hold of the LDL and pops it out the other side. This mechanism does not exist. All right. So the mechanism of transportation through an endothelial cell does not exist. We also partly have from proof that your brain has to make its own cholesterol. And the reason why it has to make its own cholesterol is because LDL cannot get in past what's called the blood-brain barrier. All right. So there are cells in your brain called glial cells that support neurons. One of their functions is to synthesize cholesterol, and it transports it about in a different form of lipoprotein. Don't worry, it gets all complicated. So we know that LDL can't get through an endothelial cell. So then the other argument is, oh, well, it gets between the endothelial cells. You go, well, have you ever looked at how endothelial cells link together in blood vessels? Well, they're linked together. They're enormously complicated. There's a thing called tight junctions, translocation junctions, and it's a bit like you've got zips and buttons, and they link together strong protein links all the way across that link together, because they can't allow anything to go between them either. Because if you allow anything to slip between endothelial cells, it will slip between endothelial cells. It will get into what they call the interstitial fluid between cells, and it will kill you.